Great. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for coming. I have to unabashedly admit that when I was asked to introduce this film, I was thrilled because as a Californian and as a water scholar, I, of course, think everybody should see this movie. And then I woke up the next morning and I realized that I was a little bit mortified because the protagonist is Jack Nicholson, and Jack Nicholson scares me. He's the Joker in Batman, he's in The Shining, and even as a benevolent private investigator, I find him a bit frightening. But I put that aside because the opportunity to introduce the movie is too good to miss. The film is daring and innovative and a classic, and besides, I was asked to talk to you about water and not the movie. So with that, I will turn us in the direction beginning with another classic, which is this view of our planet as taken from outer space. And of course, the photo shows us very clearly why we call this the blue planet. As you can see from this image, it has a lot of water. In fact, 80% of the world's surface is covered by water, which leads us to think that water is quite abundant. But as the UN has declared, water is in fact a finite and vulnerable resource. And so perhaps a better visualization of this is this one from the USGS, which shows the relative volume of water on the Earth's surface. And the sphere that's covering the Rockies shows us the volume of the world's water overall. Only 3% of this is freshwater resources. So that is the small sphere that is over Chicago. And of that, 99% of the freshwater resources is either stored as deep groundwater or as ice. And so it's not accessible to humans. So just a tiny little bubble is the amount of freshwater resources that we have. And on an average basis, it's enough to meet total water demands across the world for humans and for environmental consumption. But as we know, it's not the total amount and it's not averages that matter, but rather we need a specific quantity of water in a specific location of a specific quality at a particular point of time. So if we start to think about water resources and water availability in that context, we can see supplies in relationship to demand, and that about 2/3 of the world's global population, or approximately 4 billion people, live under conditions of severe water scarcity at least 1 month out of the year. And 500 million people in the world face severe water scarcity all year round. So this map shows you the ratio of net water withdrawals, so we can think of that as demands, to water availability. And if the number is above 1, that means our demands are greater than our supplies. And as witnessed by the large amount of red on this diagram, that does indeed constitute a large percentage of our land area. So we might expect that this scarcity would be the cause of immense amounts of conflict, but a number of rigorous studies have demonstrated that to date, cooperation is much more common than conflict when it relates to water. So 3 scholars, DeStefano, De Silva, and DeWolf, actually examined this in the international context, and they collected information of all water-related events that took place between countries who share a river basin between 1948 and 2009. So they discovered or counted up to 1,800 instances of these reported events that are related to water quality or water quantity. And then they ranked them on a scale of very conflictual, involves violence, perhaps the military, to extremely cooperative, with the middle representing some more mild tensions or others. And they found that overall, cooperative events outweigh conflictual events by a ratio of 2-to-1. Further, there were only 38 acute disputes, so acute disputes being those that involved violence or the military, and of those 38, 31 involved Israel with one of its neighboring countries. So we can say those 31 are probably not generalizable to other parts of the world. They also discovered that where water is involved in conflict, it is usually not the driver of conflict. Rather, most of the cases, it's either that there's tensions or political instability, or water is used as a tool of the military conflict. And as one analyst explains, why would you go to war over water when for the price of 1 week's fighting, you could build 5 desalination plants where you have no loss of life, no international pressure, a reliable supply that's not in a hostile territory? Seems like a bad idea. So, at the international level, we appear to have very little conflict over water. And a number of other scholars were very interested to see how this holds up and what this relates to in terms of at the international level. So a series of scholars collected data on 35 Mediterranean countries from the period 1997 to 2009. Similarly, identifying water-related events. In this case, they identified 10,354 water-related events, and each of these dots represents one of those events. The different colors represent them on a similar scale, from conflictual to cooperative, with red being conflictual. And on these, only 1.5% of the events were violent events. They then tried to identify or understand, well, what leads to those 1.5 related or percent of the events being violent? And they found that water scarcity and climate variability were completely unstatistically significant in terms of they were not good predictors of this violence. They did find that economic development increases the probability of low-level water tensions, and this makes sense. As we develop economically, we have more demand for water. But that economic development actually decreased the risk of high-intensity conflictual events. So again, looking in a positive direction. So a number of other scholars then sought to look in deeper and said, well, where water scarcity seems to be correlated with conflict, can we start to understand what is happening there? And those scholars also found that conflict that exists is often not about the water itself. For instance, there are 2 studies on conflict in the Horn of Africa, which were related to water scarcity, and they determined that that conflict was actually the result of cattle raiding. The hypothesis being that people would raid more cattle when the water was scarcer because they needed the resources. But they actually found that the reason was not that, or rather, you have to raid cattle during the dry season because it's very difficult to make a quick getaway during the wet season. So what scholars have been finding overall is that although there are indeed tensions over water resources, they frequently do not turn into violent conflict. And this is because the relationships we have regarding water are moderated by strong norms and institutions on how we moderate or govern water. So it's useful to look at that within the context of the United States. Here we're a federal government, and authority over water resources for the most part lies with the states, with some exceptions. Where water crosses an a state boundary, states enter into compacts with one another. But where water is contained within the state boundaries, each state has its own method for moderating or governing water resources, usually through a system of water rights. And we have 2 different systems of water rights, a riparian system and an appropriation system. Of course, in the case of the movie of Chinatown, we are particularly interested in California, which has a mixed system for water rights. And what this means is this: when California entered into the Union in 1850, you can imagine there's a large number of people coming from all over the world, and particularly from England. And so they adopted the English system of common law, which included with it the English system for water rights, which were a system of riparian rights. Riparian means of or along the river. And the system basically said if you are a landowner who lives of or along the river, you have the right to use and make use of the natural flow of that river on your property. Of course, during California, during the mid to late 1800s, we have a variety of other interests, not just those that are using water along the river for growing things. And in fact, there's a lot of interest in this. And of course, riparian rights do not apply very well to gold miners, particularly those interested in using water for hydraulic mining. And this didn't deter the miners at all. It is the Wild West after all, and they came up with their own system for working out their conflicts amongst themselves. And I would say that the system that they came up with was not that much different than one that I would have come up with my sisters, or any other set of siblings would have come up with, particularly when the older sibling is dominant. And this was a system which was called first in time, first in right. It has since become the law of appropriative water rights. So the key to this is that the water rights are not tied to the land, and that the senior rights holders, those who have appropriated the water first, have priority over the junior water rights holders. Also associated with it is a use it or lose it doctrine, which is if you do not demonstrate that you're using the water rights on a regular basis, you risk losing those water rights. And later, the California legislature in 1928 actually added to this a doctrine of reasonable and beneficial use, which basically prevents the waste of water. So in the late 1800s, before this reasonable and beneficial use, the California legislature actually adopted a dual system of water rights, meaning that both riparian rights and appropriative rights were in place. Riparian rights were senior to senior appropriative rights, which means that if it's the early 1900s and you live in California and you want water, you buy the land. And you can imagine how this may in fact lead to a few tensions because, of course, if you withdraw water in one location, even if you are downstream, you may be affected if that water is no longer used near the stream, but it's drawn and appropriated and moved to another property. And so this did indeed lead to a number of tensions. And in fact, in the 1915s, there were what were called the California Water Wars. As I've just said, these are not quite war on the conflict of war, but there were a few indeed violent disputes. They were primarily related to some shady land deals by the city of Los Angeles to obtain water rights in order to construct the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And then the activities of some disenfranchised community members who dynamited the canal to express their frustration. I won't go into more detail on this, except to say that the movie Chinatown takes place in the 1930s, not 1915, but it's quite powerful because it is plausible. And this indeed reflects the real world situation of the time. And of course, I think that when we have in our mind what was happening then, and we have in our mind what was happening with the California drought over the past few years, many people wonder, well, are these ongoings still occurring today? And what is the potential that such violence would occur again in the future? And I will say that it has been almost a century since then, and that there are a large number of changes that have taken place within the state of California, namely infrastructure. And the California today looks geographically very different. Each of these triangles represents a reservoir, and the lines represent different canals that drive water and move water across the state. California can now store 41 million acre-feet per water a year. To put that in context, I know many of you don't know what an acre-foot of water is. It's 1 foot of water spread across an acre. The city of Los Angeles uses 600,000 acre-feet of water per year. So the storage capacity is 70 times the amount of water that Los Angeles uses in 1 year. Another interesting development that influences where we are today has been a large development in terms of our legal and legislative policy. Some of these are laws at the federal level that were passed in the 1950s and 60s, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. But a number of them are state water acts that have involved the requirement for in-stream flow protection, for prohibiting transfers of water outside of the basin, for requiring water metering and conservation, and other factors. 3 other quick changes that I want to go through in terms of what makes California different today than it was during the time of Chinatown. One of which is that we now have a system of water markets in place. And what this water market system does is it protects people who own water rights, but allows them to let their water be used by other people. And so water is often transferred within the states. Primarily, it's transferred from agriculture to other users. Here in the dark red, we have demonstrated the purchases of water for either for short-term or long-term lease by cities, who are the primary drivers of it. But there's also a number of, in the yellow, agricultural exchanges between farmers where people with, say, large and highly valuable orchards are purchasing, but junior water rights are purchasing water from senior water rights holders. And then some water that is actually being purchased by nonprofits and by the state so that that water can remain in the stream to protect fish. The other major developments since the 1930s is a major improvement in terms of our scientific knowledge. There's a lot of monitoring of water flows, both groundwater and surface water, and our understandings of how water is transmitted through the system is dramatically better in terms of both understanding the connections between surface water and groundwater and being able to predict how changes in water use in one location affect changes in another location. And lastly, I will say that the biggest difference, perhaps beyond all of that, is that the state is very involved in water planning. Whereas in the 1930s, water use was quite decentralized. Now the Department of Water Resources puts together an annual or 5-year water plan where it looks at water and water use across the state and tries to plan on how to meet those. And in doing so, the state involves a collaborative process which involves deep engagement with stakeholders from around the region, and the stakeholders are the ones that identify their priorities, practices, and movement for collective action. So the 2018 Water Plan update is currently underway, and as you can see these are going to be the different chapters within it. As you can see within it, the focus of this is fully and 100% on sustainability and resilience, and this is because the 2011 to 2017 drought is very much on everyone's mind. And I think that's been a good thing because the effect of this drought has been more rather than less engagement between stakeholders, greater intervention by the state, and greater acceptance of intervention in the state, because the drought has raised awareness and made recognition that there needs to be, in order for a viable future, we need to have cooperation rather than conflict over water resources. So with that as my introduction, hope you will look through the film and see where some of these different elements pop up within the film, and that you enjoy the film. And if you have any questions about California or California water, or water more broadly, that's my email address.